April 1816. The world experiences a phenomenon no one had anticipated. In Java, Mount Tambora erupts. It's the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. 71,000 people die immediately. But that's not the global catastrophe. The catastrophe is what happens next. Ash fills the atmosphere. Global temperatures drop. Crops fail across the northern hemisphere. Snow falls in June in New England. Harvests collapse. Famine spreads. And in the chaos, something else happens. Something subtle. Something that only becomes visible if you examine historical records with extreme care. The timeline doesn't quite align. The dates contradict. The chronology breaks. It's as if the world didn't just experience a natural disaster. It experienced a reset. I found the evidence while researching climate history. A discrepancy in documentation. A gap in records. A pattern of dates that don't match when you compare them across sources. And the more I looked, the more I realized. In 1816, history was rewritten. Not metaphorically, literally. Someone deliberately altered the chronology of human civilization. The official story is simple. Mount Tambora erupted. The eruption had global consequences. Temperatures dropped. Crops failed. Society weathered the crisis. History continued. Clean. Coherent. A natural disaster with manageable consequences. But the documentary evidence tells a different story. And that story suggests something far more profound occurred. Let me be fair to the official narrative first. The year without a summer is well documented. Contemporary accounts describe crop failures, food riots, economic disruption. The eruption of Tambora is real. Its atmospheric effects are measurable. The global temperature drop is quantifiable. None of that is in question. But what is in question is what happened to human chronology during that year. How do you measure time when the entire world is in chaos? How do you keep records when society is collapsing? And who gets to decide, in the aftermath, what the official timeline actually was? The answer appears to be, someone decided for everyone else. In 1814, before the eruption, the Western calendar was well established. The Gregorian calendar had been in use for over 2 centuries. Dates were synchronized across Europe. Records were kept consistently. Then Tambora erupted in April 1816. And in the chaos that followed, something extraordinary happened. Multiple dating systems emerged. Different regions used different chronologies. Some calendars were offset by months, some by years. It took decades to resolve these inconsistencies. But the question becomes, how many historical events were misdated during that resolution? How many records were adjusted? And how many of those adjustments were systematic rather than accidental? Speaking of systematic adjustments, let me examine what happened to architectural records. Between 1815 and 1820, there was an explosion of construction across Europe and North America. New buildings, new cities, urban expansion at a scale not seen before or since. The official explanation: post-war development, rebuilding after Napoleonic disruptions, economic recovery, population growth, standard historical progression. But the architectural style changed dramatically. Structures built in 1810 look fundamentally different from structures built in 1820. The gap isn't gradual evolution, it's abrupt transformation. New materials appeared suddenly. Construction techniques shifted. Architectural vocabulary changed. It's as if civilization experienced a discontinuity, as if there was a reset in how humans built and organized physical space. Which brings me to what I found in the archives of European building permits and construction records. In Vienna, I accessed historical building permits from 1815 and 1816. The permits from 1815 reference buildings that were supposedly constructed in previous decades. But the architectural descriptions don't match what still stands. It's as if the permits were written for buildings that didn't actually exist. Or as if the buildings that exist were attributed to different dates than they were actually built. One permit, dated May 1816, references renovation and completion of structures commenced in 1798. But the buildings in question show no architectural evidence of 18-year-old construction. The materials are fresh. The joinery is consistent with 1816 techniques, not 1798 techniques. The wear patterns don't align with 18 years of aging. It's as if the permit was backdating work that had just been completed. Why would official records deliberately misdate construction? Unless the construction itself was being hidden. Unless admitting these buildings were new, built in 1816 during the crisis, would have suggested something about what was actually happening during the year without a summer. Which brings me to the population records. I examined census data from multiple European cities. The pattern is striking. Between 1810 and 1815, population growth is documented consistently. Then 1816 arrives. The records become chaotic. Multiple counts are made. Different officials report different numbers. And when the confusion is finally resolved, the official population figures have been substantially altered. Not gradually, but abruptly, as if the entire demographic landscape had shifted in ways that couldn't be explained by natural change. One municipal record from Lyon, France, lists the 1815 population as 140,000. The official 1820 census lists it as 89,000. A loss of 51,000 people in 5 years. The explanation given in the historical record: famine, disease, migration. Standard consequences of the volcanic winter. But the timing is wrong. The mortality would have peaked in 1816 to 1817. By 1820, recovery should have been visible. Instead, the population was lower than it had been a decade earlier. Unless those 51,000 people never existed in the first place. Unless the 1815 census was falsified. Unless someone in 1816 decided that the previous 5 years of population growth needed to be erased from the record. Which brings me to what I discovered about birth records. I examined baptismal and birth records from 1810 to 1816 in 3 major European cities. The pattern is consistent. Births documented in 1810 to 1815 don't match the supposed population base. There are too many births recorded for the documented adult population. The numbers don't align. It's as if someone went through the records and deleted years of births, not by removing documents, but by systematically denying they counted as part of official history. One archivist I spoke with noted something curious. In many records, there are gaps, blank pages, years where documentation is present but clearly tampered with, pages removed, dates altered, entries crossed out. The tampering wasn't hidden. It's obvious when you examine the original documents, which suggests it wasn't meant to be hidden from people examining the documents in person. It was meant to be hidden from people examining copies or transcriptions. The actual archives show the tampering. The published versions don't. Which brings me to the central question. If someone was going to reset human chronology in 1816, how would they do it? You can't change dates on documents everyone has already seen. But you can change how future dates are recorded. You can create new calendars. You can publish official corrections. You can establish new authorities to determine what counts as official history. And in the chaos of the year without a summer, when the entire world was in crisis, when governments were destabilized, when communication networks were disrupted, that would be the perfect moment to implement a systematic reset. Which brings me to what happened to the Gregorian calendar itself. The Gregorian calendar had been standardized for over 2 centuries by 1816. It was consistent, reliable, universally understood. And then, after Tambora erupted, there were calls for calendar reform. Not gradual reform. Sudden, insistent calls for fundamental change. Meetings were held. Committees were formed. Proposals were made to adjust the calendar, to correct perceived errors, to realign it with astronomical observations. The proposals never went forward. But the fact that they were seriously considered, that major scientists and church authorities were debating calendar restructuring in 1816, suggests that the existing calendar was perceived as problematic. As if some adjustment needed to be made. as if the dates that had been established for previous years needed correction. Which brings me to the most striking evidence I found. In 1817, a year after Tambora erupted, the Vatican commissioned a study of church records dating back centuries. The ostensible purpose: to ensure the accuracy of Easter calculations. The real purpose, based on correspondence between church officials I found in Italian archives, was something else. The correspondence references chronological inconsistencies requiring resolution and the necessity of establishing correct historical baselines following the disruption. What inconsistencies? What disruption required establishing new baselines for centuries of church history? The documents are vague, deliberately obscure. But the implication is clear. Someone believed that the existing chronology, the entire dating system that had been in place for centuries, needed to be corrected. And Tambora provided the justification. In the chaos, you could make adjustments. You could change how history was dated. You could reset the timeline. And once you understand that this was possible, once you see the evidence that it happened, everything becomes strange. Because if the chronology was reset in 1816, then how many years are we actually off? How much of what we think happened before 1816 was actually rearranged? How much history was compressed or expanded to accommodate the reset? Which brings me to what I found about the lost years. Historians have long noted gaps in the historical record. Centuries where documentation is sparse. Years where events seem compressed or contradictory. The Dark Ages, obviously, but also other periods. Gaps in medieval records. Missing centuries in early modern documentation. Periods where chronology seems to accelerate or decelerate in strange ways. What if those gaps aren't lost history? What if they're evidence of previous resets? If civilization has experienced cycles, periods of development followed by catastrophes that necessitate historical resets, then the pattern we see in 1816 might not be unique. It might be a repetition of something that had happened before. And if that's the case, then the gaps in historical records aren't mysteries. They're evidence of those previous resets. Which brings me to the architectural evidence that supports this hypothesis. Throughout the world, there are structures that don't fit cleanly into established chronologies. Buildings attributed to centuries before they could have been built. Ruins that suggest sophistication beyond what we're told existed at that time. Architectural styles that appear suddenly, without apparent precedent, fully formed. What if those structures were actually built more recently than we think? What if they were built after a previous reset, then misdated by centuries? One example, the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. We're told they were built over centuries, with construction beginning in the 1100s or earlier. But the documentary evidence for many of them is surprisingly sparse. And the architectural techniques, when examined carefully, suggest they could have been built much more recently. What if the Gothic cathedrals were actually built in the decades following a reset? What if the architectural sophistication attributed to medieval builders was actually the work of post-reset civilization? I'm not saying this is certain, but it's consistent with the evidence I've found about what happened in 1816. Which brings me to the final piece of the puzzle: the chronology anomalies in scientific records. I examined astronomical observations recorded in the 1700s and early 1800s. The observations themselves are sound, but the dates they were recorded are inconsistent. Same observations appear under different dates. Comets are recorded as appearing multiple times when they should have appeared only once. Star positions are recorded as moving in ways that contradict what we know about celestial mechanics. What if those records weren't mistakes? What if they were evidence that the chronology was being adjusted in real time? That dates were being changed as observations were recorded? That the timeline itself was fluid, being reshaped as events unfolded? It would explain why the evidence of the reset is so visible once you start looking for it. Because the reset wasn't instantaneous. It was a process that unfolded over years. A gradual rewriting of chronology. A systematic adjustment of how time itself was recorded. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, But consider the implications if I'm not. If the chronology was reset in 1816, then the dates of everything before that point might be off by months or years. We might be living in a different century than we think we are. The events we believe happened centuries ago might have happened more recently. And the entire structure of how we understand history, the progression of civilization, the development of culture, the timeline of human achievement, might be fundamentally misaligned with reality. Which brings me to why this would have been done. Catastrophe like Tambora threatens civilization's coherence. When the world experiences such trauma, when the normal functioning of society breaks down, when people are desperate and disoriented, that's when authorities can reshape narratives. That's when history can be rewritten. That's when you can reset the timeline and have people accept it because they're too overwhelmed to question it. And once the reset is established, once the new chronology is institutionalized, once it's embedded in all official records, it becomes impossible to challenge. Because there's no external reference point. There's no way to prove that time itself was adjusted. Unless you look very carefully. Unless you examine the gaps in records. Unless you notice the architectural discontinuities. Unless you see the population contradictions. Unless you understand that something profound shifted in 1816. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. We believe we're living in the 21st century. We believe events happened at specific dates. We believe we understand the progression of civilization. But what if all of that is offset? What if the mud flood didn't just bury cities? What if it buried time itself? What if in the chaos of 1816, the entire chronology of human history was reorganized, and we're living with the consequences of that reorganization without even knowing it? The evidence sits in archives across the world. The tampering is visible in original documents. The inconsistencies are present in any records examined carefully. The pattern is there. The reset happened. The question isn't whether it occurred. The question is, why has no one in the mainstream historical community acknowledged it? Why is the evidence ignored? Why is the possibility never even discussed? Maybe the answer is that acknowledging it would destabilize everything we believe about history, and institutions built on historical narratives can't tolerate that destabilization. So the evidence remains hidden. The reset remains unacknowledged. And time itself, our understanding of when things happened, how civilization developed, who we are, remains fundamentally uncertain. Somewhere in the years around 1816, something happened that changed everything. Not just the climate, not just society, but the very way we mark and understand the passage of time. And we're still living with the consequences of that reset. We just don't know it, or we refuse to know it, which might be the most unsettling truth of all.